Thank you for joining iMeet. This meeting is now being recorded.
Awesome. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Spring 2017 Active Minds Media Training. Just to tell you a little bit about me, who I am and why I'm giving this training. Just wanted to introduce myself really quick. I'm Lauren Abdill. I was Active Minds Communications Manager until last August when I left to go to grad school. Before that, I got my bachelor's in journalism from the University of Maryland, and I was a reporter at a couple different papers ranging from my local hometown paper, the Frederick News Post, to McClatchy Tribune, which is an international news wire. So I have a lot of experience reporting, and then I also was a student advocate when I was in school. I did a lot of sexual assault prevention work, so I also was on the other end a lot where I was being interviewed by reporters. So I kind of like to think that I have a good sense of what it is to be on both sides of the interview. The first point that I wanted to make today is really just how important you are to the media. College mental health is a really big story right now, and judging from the response we're getting to 13 Reasons Why, I don't think that's going to be going away anytime soon. And you're really the golden source that reporters are looking for. Yes, they might want to talk to college mental health or, college counselors, or they might want to talk to administrators, but mostly they're going to want to be talking to students who live with mental illness or are advocates for people who do live with mental illness. And Active Minds is really synonymous with college mental health. So we connect students, or we did when I was there, and we still do connect students to reporters all the time. You are the student voice of Active Minds, and I would say the most important voice of Active Minds. And I say that as someone who was the voice of Active Minds as the national office. For 2 years, you are more important than we are at the national office. You're our very best spokespeople and the people who, tell our story and show what Active Minds does the best. But a caveat here for anyone who needs it, if you're not comfortable or interested in giving media interviews, that is perfectly okay. And I actually think it's really helpful if you know that about yourself. Maybe you don't realize it until you do a couple interviews and you say, yeah, this isn't for me. I just don't like talking about myself in this format. And that's fine. I just want to say to anyone watching that if it's not your cup of tea, that's okay. And the national office can work with you to find someone in your chapter who can be that spokesperson. So these are just a couple examples of some really great media that Active Minds chapter members have gotten. This was a big deal, a piece about a SAC member that ran in the Wall Street Journal. This was also a big deal in NBC News. This is another SAC member. Yes Magazine is, I believe, an online magazine, so this is kind of cool. You see that we hit the big newspapers at the Wall Street Journal, we got the big broadcast stations with NBC News, and now we've kind of got a smaller online magazine, and WashingtonJewishWeek, which is a small print publication in D.C. with a really niche audience. So just kind of cool to see how many different types of media agencies are reporting on this topic, and how varied mental health, like how attractive of a topic mental health is to agencies like WashingtonJewishWeek that maybe you wouldn't know would cover something like student mental health. So to start, I just want to say kind of you are right as a source for a piece. You have the right to know who the reporter is, including the background, what's the news organization, what's the story, and specifically what's the reporter's angle. So they might say, oh, my story is about college mental health. And you can say, great, that's a really broad topic. Are you talking about suicide prevention? Are you talking about anxiety? Are you talking about eating disorders? Like, what exactly is your angle that you're really looking at? It's helpful to know what the deadline is. A lot of times reporters, especially for big daily papers, will contact you and say, hey, we need to talk to someone immediately because I'm on deadline at 8 p.m. tonight. So that can be helpful to get a sense of, like, yes, I can fit this in today, or no, I can't. Who else is being interviewed, and when a mutually convenient time is to talk. So I actually would say not only are these your rights as a source, but it's actually best practice to ask these questions before you agree to being interviewed, because it gives you a good sense of what the interview might be like, whether you're a good fit for the interview. Like, if they reach out to you and say, yeah, we're doing a piece on students with PTSD, you can say, oh, that's great. I'm actually not a student with PTSD, but we have another chapter member who is, so why don't I connect you with them? I actually was interviewed by a reporter a couple days ago for a small Minnesota online outlet, and I asked all these questions first to be like, okay, what exactly are you talking about? How do I fit into this? And it just made me a whole lot more comfortable going into the interview, having a sense of what she was going to be asking. And a note on that, a lot of sources will ask to be sent the questions before the interview so they can kind of get, they can practice their answers essentially. You can always request the questions to be sent to you beforehand, but be prepared that the reporter might say it's against newsroom policy and they won't send them. It's kind of a mark of whether or not the reporter is good if they'll send them to you or not, because in journalism school, I always learned never to send a source questions beforehand. But with student journalists especially, they might not know that yet, so use that to your advantage. I think it's always worth asking, hey, would you mind sending me the questions just so I can be prepared? So the media guidelines for reporting on suicide, this is a really important resource both for you and for the reporter. So if you're not familiar with this resource, the link is here at the bottom. And basically, the leading suicide prevention organizations came together to put together these recommendations for how the media should and should not talk about mental health, and really specifically suicide. So a lot of it is around the language, like you should say died by suicide, you shouldn't say committed suicide because that has a negative and stigmatizing connotation. If there is a suicide, in your town or city, you should not say how the person died by suicide. They have suggestions for what the headline should look like, and then they have content that media outlets can use as sidebars, like warning signs of suicide and how to talk to someone you love about suicide. So I would every time I spoke with a reporter when I was at Active Minds, which was probably 200 plus times that happened, I would send them this link. I would mention it and send them this link after our conversation and say, I'd really appreciate you taking a look at this and making sure that you're following these guidelines. And I also think it's helpful for you. I'm sorry if you guys can hear my dog. The male is probably here. It's also helpful for you to know what these guidelines say so you can model that language. Like in your interview, you should be saying died by suicide and not committed suicide. And doing so is going to make the reporter more likely to follow that same language when they're writing the piece. So that's kind of another best practice when you're giving interviews on this topic. Okay, so preparing for an interview, I often find that this is the most nerve-wracking part for being a source. It's not even, the actual interview isn't that bad once you get into it and start talking, but the build-up can be, there's a lot of anxiety there for folks. So just some guidelines and tips. Have an idea of what you want to say At this point, once you've scheduled an interview, you should have a sense of what their story is and how your interview fits into that story. Most likely, you're going to be the human element. You're going to be the actual face and representation of college mental health. So kind of understand how you fit into that specific story. This is really important. Understand the toughest questions that you could face. And I would say, secondly important, try to get a sense of what you are and aren't willing to share. Reporters can be pretty tactless sometimes, I would say, depending on their skill level. And you might get a question like, have you attempted suicide? Or if you disclose that maybe a friend from high school died by suicide and that's why you got into active minds, they might say, well, how did they die? So kind of that stuff, just be prepared for it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that on the next slide as well. But just in preparing for the interview, kind of think through what your own boundaries are and what you are and aren't willing to share. So stay on message. That's important. Have your key points written in it. A lot of times when I was doing an interview, I would have my key points in front of me so I could just quick glance down at them if I needed to. And have a few examples of your chapter's work ready to share. You can say, raising awareness is really important, and that's why we brought Gun Violence Packing to campus in fall of 2016, or that's why we participated in Suicide Prevention Month, whatever it may be. Oh, I guess it's not this slide that I talk about media boundaries, but I will get there. So make sure that you familiarize yourself with key facts related to student mental health. And key facts here is highlighted, and we'll take you to an Active Minds webpage that has a lot of this information. But to pull out some of the important points that reporters like to hear, suicide is the second leading cause of death. A third of college students report having felt so depressed that they couldn't function. And mental health issues in the college student population are associated with lower GPA and higher probability of dropping out of college. A lot of these are the questions the answers to the question of, well, why is this important? Why are you doing this work? You can pull those if you have them in your back pocket, pull them out. If you don't know the answer to a question, don't guess. Just say, I'm actually not sure what the answer is. I would suggest that you contact someone in the communications department at the Active Minds National Office, and then they'll be able to handle that question. And then make sure that everything that you tell them is on the record. It's kind of like a media jargony term, but essentially when you're in an interview with a reporter, everything that you say, they have the legal ability to print. And so saying you're on the record and off the record, it can get kind of confusing if you're switching on and off. So I would say make sure everything you want them to know is on the record. And then if there's anything you want to tell them off the record, like, hey, just so you know, a heads up, we heard that, the president might be launching a mental health task force, so stay tuned for that, but we don't want you to report it yet. Wait till the end of your interview and then give them all the off-the-record stuff you want to so you're not switching back and forth, because then I think it can get kind of confusing, and that's kind of where you're opening yourself up to the risk of the reporter including some off-the-record stuff in the actual piece. Okay, so during the interview, this is kind of standard practice of PR and answering questions, but in responding to a question, you have to address the question. So if they say, why is anxiety so prevalent on college campuses, you'll say, anxiety is a prevalent issue because blah, blah, blah. And instead of starting with, well, because there's so much pressure to be perfect. And this is especially important if you're doing a television or a radio interview where they're using your audio, because if you think about it, in a news segment like that, they don't show the reporter asking the question, like, why is anxiety important? Anxiety is important, or whatever. they'll just have the person stating the answer to the question, and so that's why you need to kind of address what the question is in your answer, if that makes sense. And I feel like I said that kind of confusing, so if anyone needs me to double back on that during the question and answer portion, feel free. And if the conversation starts to drift into a place that you don't know that much about, or you don't want to talk about, or it's not what they said you were going to be talking about, you can use what's called bridging, and that's kind of a way to pivot to get you back on track. So something like, that's a great point, but what I really want to emphasize here is, or that's not my area of expertise, but what I can tell you is, and that's kind of a cue to the reporter of like, okay, I need to steer this interview back in this direction, and they should go along with it if they're a skilled reporter. Another good tip is using flagging. This is kind of, as a journalist, this makes our ears perk up when we hear these phrases. So something like, the best part about my story is, or this speaks to a bigger point, or if you remember one thing from this interview. That's a really good one. That's one of my favorite ones to use. When I would say that with reporters, whatever followed, if you remember one thing, that would almost always end up in the piece. So these are just good little tips, to use if you want to really emphasize something. Okay, now to reporter boundaries. I think this is really, really important, and I really want to emphasize this for you guys. You do not have to answer any questions that you're uncomfortable with. Like I said, reporters can be tactless, and it might just be because they don't know how sensitive of an issue this is, but you should be prepared for that. And if they do ask you something that you're not willing to talk about, all you need to say, and you can even have this written down too, so if you need to glance at it, I'm not comfortable answering that, but I'm more than happy to talk to you about the work my chapter did around eating disorder awareness, or whatever it may be. The reporters should back off. If they don't, you have the right to end the interview. I feel like being a source, especially when you're a college student, being a media source and talking to a reporter, it feels like there's this kind of power dynamic where they're the professional and, they're the reporter from the Wall Street Journal and you're just a sophomore at the University of Maryland. You have equal power in this interview, in any interview, and I just really want you to know that you have the agency and the power to say, number one, I'm not going to answer that. And number two, if you keep pushing me on it, I'm going to end this interview. So just know that that's a card that you can play if you need to. And I have done that before too. And for a lot of reporters, it ends up being a good lesson for them of like, oh, I need to figure out another way to ask these questions, or, I need to respect when a source isn't willing to talk about something that I want them to talk about. If you have an interaction like this with a reporter, I really encourage you to let the communications team at Active Minds know. This happened a few times while I was there, and basically I would follow up with a reporter and just say really gently, hey, I know you talked to one of our students, and I understand that it ended, the student ended the interview prematurely. Is there anything I can do to fill those gaps in your piece, what you were looking for? And then also in the future, when talking to students about mental health, I would really encourage you to approach this more gently or, with more grace. A lot of students are uncomfortable talking, about certain issues. So it's just a good way for the national office to kind of have your back, and also for the reporter to learn a lesson from what happened. But I will say this this doesn't happen a ton. Like, I feel like it is more likely to happen with a student reporter who's, hasn't been around for that long and is still kind of learning this stuff. So if you're working with a big outlet, this probably wouldn't happen. Okay, during an on-camera interview, these are just some logistical recommendations, and I'm actually really proud of myself because I'm sitting in a swivel chair right now, and I haven't been swiveling, so yay me, I do that a lot. So don't swivel if you're in a chair and on camera. Place your feet on the floor, put your hands on your knees or your thighs. Be lively but not jerky, so you don't want to have like wild gestures, but you can, use your hands to really emphasize a point or what have you. Maintain eye contact with the reporter. I love this phrase, to avoid looking shifty. I just think that is just eloquent. So remember that when you're in an interview, you're going to be talking to a reporter, you're going to be looking at them, you're not going to be speaking into the camera because it's not the public service announcement. But this is a good point. Look at the camera if you are being interviewed in a remote location. So like sometimes, let's say NBC News in New York wants to interview a student in Charlotte, North Carolina. That student will go to their satellite studio or location while they'll sit and be filmed and then kind of like streamed into the interview. In stand-up interviews, keep your hands in front of you, ready to gesture, but again, nothing wild. Smile if appropriate on your interview. Television in general can make people look like they're scowling, and a voice sounds more appealing when you're smiling, but, use it when it's appropriate. You don't want to be like, suicide is the second leading cause, but I'm sure you all know that. You're super smart. You're a superstar chapter leader. So just use discretion with that. And an important point, 90% of your effectiveness is determined really not what you say, but how you say it. So using your body mannerisms to flag things or emphasize things, and showing emotion, but not so emotional that you can't continue with the interview. Although if that does happen, that's okay. It's just, you want to try to keep it so that you're showing authenticity and genuineness, and also how important the topic is. But you want to hopefully not get so worked up talking about it that you're not able to continue with the interview. But again, if that happens, that's okay because we're human and we have feelings and emotions, and that's totally fine. Okay, some talking points. I always recommend reviewing these briefly before you give an interview. This is just kind of the history of Active Minds. They might ask you about it. So I won't read these verbatim, but I'm guessing everyone knows the story in general. Active Minds was founded by Allison Malman, who's our current executive director and founder, after her brother died by suicide. And when she returned to school at the University of Pennsylvania, she wanted to start some kind of mental health awareness organization, but there wasn't one. So she started the first Active Minds chapter in her dorm room. We were established to change the conversation about mental health, all that good stuff. So the national office, what we do, we are the voice for student mental health. We're the only organization working to use the student voice to raise awareness around mental health. And we do this through, actually, this is a little outdated. I believe we're now more than 450 student-led chapters. Robin, correct me if I'm wrong at the end.
We're close. 445, but we usually say over 400 because that number changes.
Okay, actually, scratch that. The slide is accurate. We're close to 450, though, so good job, everyone. And then some talking points. If you're kind of not sure what to say or how to present your own story, these are just some suggestions. Given my own personal struggles, I find great value in what Active Minds does. I'm sharing my story to lend my voice to Active Minds' mission. My goal is to be a symbol of hope and show those struggling that you can still go on to do great things and be successful. Feel free to use these if you need to, or if you know what you want to say and have that ready, go for that too. After the interview, you can ask the reporter to review the quotes that you give or to review the piece in general. But again, the reporter might say it's against newsroom policy, and I'd say it's actually less likely that a reporter will send you the piece or send you your quotes than it is that they would send you the interview questions, because then you get into this tricky business of someone wants to change what they said on the record because it doesn't sound quite as elegant written out, and you can't do that. So again, you can ask, but it might not happen. You can also ask for your quotes to be read back to you over the phone, not really for approval, because they don't need your approval since you said it, but more so you know exactly what they included from your interview. And I'd say that's a pretty common request, and most reporters are okay with that. If there's an error in the story, or if you feel like you were misquoted or misrepresented, contact the reporter immediately to talk about your concerns and either ask for a correction, which is where something is blatantly wrong and they need to issue a correction to say, if that was wrong, here's the right thing, or a clarification. And that's kind of like the issue's a little bit more nuanced than they presented it in the piece, and they need to just issue something to clear up some confusion. A really common request, even though we send the reporters the guidelines for reporting on suicide, and even though we use the right language, a lot of times reporters will still write or say committed suicide. And so it's totally appropriate for you to write them and say, hey, I was hoping that you could change, the online version at least. If it's print, they won't be able to change it after it's published. But everything's online these days. You can say, can you please change the language to reflect the best practices surrounding safely talking about suicide? And most reporters will be more than willing to accommodate. It's really in their best interest for the piece to be as accurate as possible. So don't be scared or feel weird about doing it. If you do, or maybe if you're not super comfortable with the reporter in general, reach out to the Active Minds Communications Office. Again, that's something that they can help with. This is super important, post-interview self-care. It can be really, really draining to share your story with someone. And I think just the media process in general, like the excitement of knowing that you're being interviewed and the anxiety that comes along with it, and then maybe some doubt afterwards if I should have said this or I wish I had made this point better. Just all in all, it can be really emotional. And then I think when you add on the layer of, talking about mental health, either their own experiences or the experiences of a family member or a loved one, it can be really draining. And then even more so if a reporter asks an insensitive question, that can be triggering. So it's really important to schedule some post-interview self-care. Just take really good care of yourself. Do those little extra things that you need to help yourself kind of cope and process with the process of being an interview source, because it can be really draining. So know that that's normal. As you get better practice with it and you do it more often and you get less nervous, it probably won't be as draining for you. But in the beginning, for sure, take good care of yourself when you're talking to reporters. And then remember, the national office is here to support you. If you ever need any assistance, you can reach out to Tam Nikita, who is my old boss. She's the communications director, and that's her email. Okay, and we can open it up for questions now.
Awesome. And remember, if you are trying to ask a question, that you're currently muted, so make sure to unmute yourself. I have a question, Lauren, that I can ask, and this is Robert from the National Office. I'm wondering what either your hardest or like one of the types of hardest questions you've been asked by a reporter, and how you maybe answer that or kind of parlayed that into another topic or something like that.
Sure. Do you mean like me personally or as a spokesperson for Active Minds?
Either one.
I would say, okay, I kind of think of two scenarios. One of them is where there's a really tactless reporter. Like I think I mentioned in the beginning, I did a lot of sexual assault prevention work when I was in college, and that's because I'm a survivor of sexual assault. And I was at a protest in 2013, I think, where we were trying to get the Department of Education to better enforce Title IX regulations. So it was like a rally for survivors of college sexual violence. And a reporter came up to me. She had a cameraman with her. She put a microphone in my face and said, "Tell me about your rape." And that was, I mean, talk about tactless, sensitive. Like, I was floored. And I think I said something like, "That's a really insensitive question, and I'm going to encourage you to ask that in a different way and in a more compassionate way in further interviews, and I am not going to be in this interview." And I walked away. Kind of similar to that, when I was at Active Minds, I got asked quite frequently how Brian Malman, Allison's brother, died, like what means he used. So I tried to use that as an educating point of like, okay, actually it's not appropriate or safe to report on the means that a person died by suicide, because research shows that increases vulnerable readers' likeliness that they will attempt suicide in that manner. So I tried to use it as kind of, a learning opportunity. And a lot of times they were like, "Oh, I had no idea. People often report on, it was a gun or, it was an overdose." And I'm like, yeah, people aren't supposed to do that. So you should, you should follow suit and not do that. And then, so that's kind of the one camp of questions that are really personal or insensitive. And then the other camp, I would get really complex questions about mental health in general. Like, can you comment on the CDC saying that even though rates of mental health are increasing for 18 to 24-year-old, suicide rates are actually slightly decreasing, or something like that? And I would always say, I'm not a public health expert. I don't have a PhD. I don't, I'm not an expert on mental health in general. I am an expert on what Active Minds does. And then I would always have kind of a source ready to say, if you're interested in, learning more about kind of the nuanced data and stats about mental health, I have a contact, at SAMHSA who might be able to help you with that. So kind of owning what you don't know is totally fine.
Awesome. Other questions for Lauren or for me from here at the office?
I'm so good. I covered everything.
I know.
Robin, can you think of anything left out?
I don't think so. I guess I'd just say potentially that you can definitely also email us at the chapters team if you're looking for help preparing for an interview, or you had an interview that you're not super sure about, or something along the lines that you want to talk to us about. You can always email us pretty much with anything, but especially with these things at chapters@activeminds.org. You'll get me or one of the other folks on the chapters team, and we'll help you out in whatever way makes sense there. Yeah. I'll also just say, because this webinar is being recorded and people who are not here will view it later, if you're viewing this webinar not in real time and you want the credit for viewing the webinar, send an email to the chapters at Active Minds email address saying that you watched this webinar. That way we can mark that down. And it looks like Austin and Becky don't have any questions. thanks so much, Lauren, for this. I think it's going to be a really invaluable, helpful tool for us to have forever and ever.
Yay. Okay, thanks so much for listening. Austin and Becky and Robin, thanks for asking me to do this. This was super fun.
Okay, great. So on that note, I guess I will give you all your Thursday afternoon, and hopefully we'll be hearing from all of you soon.
Bye, guys. Take
All right.
care.
Bye.